Hello, writers, and welcome to the London Writers Salon podcast. I'm Parul. I'm your host and the co-founder of the London Writers Salon. Our salon interviews are a chance for us to go behind the scenes of a writer's journey and dig into the stories behind the stories. And each week, we invite to the salon a writer that we admire to explore the craft of writing, the art of building a writing career, and the reality of navigating the creative world. Today, we have the honor of speaking with Sophie Flynn. Sophie is the author of thrillers. Her latest is What Stays Unsaid, and she's also the managing director of Jericho Writers. So today I'll be talking to Sophie about her craft as a writer, why she's decided to write in this genre, how she writes, and her experience of not only writing but running a creative community at Jericho, and what she's learned about the publishing process along the way. So as always, I have a bunch of questions for Sophie, but in around an hour or so, we'll open it up to the room for any questions that you might have. So at any point during this interview, if you have any questions, do pop them in the chat and we will try to circle around to it at the end. So without further ado, welcome to the London Writers Salon. Sophie.
Hello, thank you so much for having me here. It's really, really lovely to be here.
You're welcome. And being admiring your work from afar, both as a creative and also a community builder. But before we get to all of that stuff, I'd love to just go back to your past, I suppose, your history to writing and reading. So as a reader, I'd love to know your taste. What kind of stories did you read maybe growing up? Maybe we start there.
Growing up, I had two quite distinct genres that I always read. My dad and my mum are both big readers. My dad was the kind of very typical male reader. Harlan Coben was huge in our house. All those sort of very macho spy thrillers where you've got the gorgeous man with lots of women to save. So I did read a lot of that. And my mum used to read quite a lot of women's fiction as well, kind of Adele Parks, Katie Ford, Lisa Jewell, all of those books, but really they're both just huge readers and still are now. So I read pretty much everything. Those were the two main things that I would always go to. And I think once I realised there was a world outside of the kind of big macho spy thrillers, my world really changed quite a lot.
And as a reader, as a writer, sorry.
Yeah,
What has your relationship been? When did you start to take writing seriously?
To be honest, not for, I say quite a while, but I think the older you get, the more you realise how young you were when you did everything. So I used to do mostly music. I did a lot of like performing arts as a child. I did my degree in music and always kind of had the idea that I would be a musician. And it kind of took me realising that what I really loved about music was the lyrics and the storytelling of songs, and the rest I wasn't really particularly bothered about. I didn't really love the idea of going into the industry. So around kind of mid-20s was when I really I'd always written in some form, mostly lyrics, and I had to do poetry at uni while I did music because you had to do some other thing. I'm very bad at poetry, but I'd kind of dabbled in that way. And then it was really when I was working, I'd been working for only a couple of years, and realized that I just wasn't doing anything creative, and I'd always been creative. And then suddenly you have a 9-to-5 job and you're exhausted and you just realize you're not really making anything anymore. So I just joined a local creative writing class, which got me into properly writing. Although I wouldn't say I took it seriously for kind of a number of years after that. I really didn't have the confidence to say I was writing a book or that I could be a writer. That took me quite a while.
So your first book was All My Lies, and at the time you were a police press officer, is that right?
Yeah, I was when I started writing it, yeah.
And was that the first book you'd ever attempted to write?
Yeah, it was actually, and I'm lucky in that regard. I know a lot of people don't kind of get that first book published, but I did, and I'd never written a book before. But I always think I didn't really write one book because the book was rewritten so many times, and like the first time I finished it, it really just had no plot. The second time I finished it, I had a one-to-one with an editor at an event, and they said, "Oh, why are you saying it's a thriller when it's women's fiction?" And I was like, "Oh, I don't know." So it went through so many different versions before it became the book that got published. But yes, I was still lucky to get that first book done.
And place us in your life at that point when you were in that process of writing, rewriting, redrafting your book. What were you doing? You had a full-time job on the side?
Yeah, so I started writing mostly while I was at the police, and because I really didn't know any writers, and my family aren't writers, they're not kind of in the creative world, it really felt something very, very inaccessible to me. I just didn't know how people wrote books. I just knew that you could go to university for things. So I got a whacking great student loan and applied to do an MA at Oxford Brookes, which was my most local university, although it wasn't local because it was about an hour and a half from where I was living at the time. So I kind of begged my boss to let me leave work a little bit early every Thursday to drive over to Oxford, which took months of convincing, because the police is very rigid. And yeah, then I started doing the MA part-time for 2 years. I was always late. I was not top of the class by any means. I was always stressed. A lot of people were doing it in their retirement or kind of working part-time. I started it when I was 26, and I was just so unsure of myself in every way. I just felt like I shouldn't be there. I felt like it was kind of ridiculous that they'd even let me in the course. So there was like a lot of confidence issues, I think, when I was first writing. And over the course of the MA, I wrote the first 30,000 words of the book. So I finished with these 30,000 words, but honestly, just no idea how to finish a book. And then when I finally did finish the book, I had a complete meltdown when I realized I needed to edit it. Which I do still have those meltdowns editing my books now, but it was like a real moment of pure panic, because I just had in my head, if you just get to the end of the book, it'll be fine. And then suddenly I was at the end of the book, and I realized that's actually where the really, really hard work, for me at least, comes. And yeah, I think I was working at a creative agency by that point because I'd moved jobs. I eventually cut down to 4 days a week, which is, I think, honestly, the biggest tipping point for me of taking it seriously. I kind of realized I was never gonna do it in the time I had. I was really stressed, and just not managing life very well. And I thought I basically asked my work to do, I think it was maybe 4 months, it wasn't very long, to just trial going to 4 days a week. And obviously I wasn't being paid very much. I think I was probably 28 at the time. So it was a big financial cut, and that really pushed me on to take it seriously, because I thought, well, like, I'm married, we have a joint mortgage, we have joint bills, we have joint everything, and my husband's so supportive and he really believed in me, but it felt quite selfish to be like, I'm going to take so much of our income away for me to sit at home and write a book which no one's asked me to write. But it meant that on that day that I had off to write, I was deadly serious about it, and I used every moment I could. And I do think if I hadn't kind of taken that leap of faith, that I might not have finished the book. Or I might not have, I probably would have, but it would have took a lot longer. And I think I would have let that self-doubt creep in. I kind of almost needed to take that big risk, which for some people wouldn't be that much of a risk. But for me, to cut down to 4 days just felt so indulgent.
Especially if you weren't surrounded by people who sort of believed in that.
No, it was just, I remember like one of my old friends said to me when I was doing the MA, she's like, well, what are you doing it for? And I was like, because I want to write a book. And she was like, oh, how lovely. I'd do that if I had free time. I was like, I don't have free time. And it just wasn't a thing. Everyone felt around me that it was quite indulgent. Whereas now I know so many writers that it's just, that doesn't feel crazy to me at all. But I remember it really did then. And it was a big leap of faith.
So you started, as you said, when you were this police press officer, you then took another job in a creative agency, is that right?
Yeah, it was a job, basically just like doing copywriting and stuff for people like Jaguar Land Rover, doing incentive schemes. So we also did boiler things, so I know a lot about boilers. I've written a lot of copy about boilers.
Very handy. That could come into a thriller about gas man. I don't know. And so then and so you started to take it seriously. You took a day off. For how many years was it until you actually, so you started when you're 26, 28, you took the other job. How long before you finished your first book?
And then before my job I have now, I always moved jobs a lot because I used to get very bored. So I moved again after that, went to work in a company that didn't really get on with that well, but I was there for about a year and a bit, and then I got the job at Jericho. But by the time I moved to Jericho, I was already kind of submitting to agents and doing stuff. So I got my deal really early on into being with Jericho. And people always think it's through Jericho because it was so soon, but it wasn't. I just happened to have just moved there. So I kind of got published and had Jericho at the same time, by coincidence, really.
And then you submitted 22 query letters, is that right?
If I've said that somewhere, then yes. I was really upset because I used to have a spreadsheet where I had all of the people I'd submitted to and all my rejections, and all the yeses, and I've lost it. It got deleted off my Google Drive, but I do have a screenshot of it somewhere. But it was at least that. It was quite a lot.
I read somewhere, I think you were interviewed and you talked about the number of submissions, number of yeses.
Yeah, that would have been when I had my spreadsheet.
So you landed a deal through a direct submission in the end to Simon and Schuster, their digital only imprint.
Yeah.
Tell us about that. How did that come about?
It's quite random, really. I'd been quite lucky in a way with submissions. I'd got through my MA, we did a like an anthology at the end of the year, and I had an agent come back to me off the back of that before I'd even finished the book and say, I really like it, would really like to read it. And I've still got it printed out above my computer. Even though that agent went on to ghost me from a full manuscript, it still really just changed the way I thought about everything. I didn't think that agents would ever talk to me, and suddenly there was one in my inbox. So I submitted to a bunch of agents, and I got a real mixed bag of, I had some really great things, like I entered the Curtis Brown First Novel Prize. I don't think they do it anymore, but it had like 3,000 entries, and I didn't get on the long list. I didn't get anywhere, so I was really sad. And then one night I was rehearsing in a band I used to be in, and I got an email pop up saying, although you didn't make the long list, one of our agents really, really likes what you've written. Could you submit your full manuscript? And I thought that's amazing. Out of 3,000 people, not even getting on the long list, but one of them wanting my full manuscript. And I didn't end up signing with her, but she gave me a huge amount of feedback to rewrite the book. So then I submitted to a bunch of agents, kept getting really close, and then ultimately they said no. And that carried on for, God, it must have been at least 6 months. So I started writing another book, and then I just saw on Twitter that Simon and Schuster were holding an open day it was their first ever crime thriller open day, where you could submit directly to them without an agent. And I thought, oh, why not? I popped it on the Jericho Writers Teams chat, and they were like, yeah, sounds good, because I just didn't know at that stage what was good and what wasn't really. And they were like, yeah, I'd go for it. And they came back really quickly with an offer for a digital publishing deal. And I, at that point, went to all the agents. I don't think I had it out with many agents, but I went out to the one I did, which was Kate Nash, and said, I'm going to withdraw it because I don't need an agent anymore. And she came back and was like, no, let's have a conversation. We were actually about to call you anyway. So then I signed with an agent after I had the deal, which is obviously a bit backwards. I don't think I'd accepted the deal fully, but I was sure I was going to accept it. So yeah.
And what do you think and this is a question I had for you, is I always advise writers to get agents. Just from my experience, they help negotiate for you. What do you think Kate brought that you might not have been able to do yourself in that process?
I think because of the way I approached it, it was a bit chaotic. Because I mean, one of the things that happened, which I don't actually ever talk about, but when I had kind of gone through and formally agreed the deal with Simon and Schuster, I was then approached by another publisher, a bigger, not bigger, but it would have been a bigger deal, because of the deal I was on with Simon and Schuster was very small. Basically, that I'd spoken to on Twitter. I still don't know why it happened, because it was really random, and it felt random at the time because I wasn't anybody, and we just had a back and forth chat on Twitter. And then they were quite interested in the book, and the editor was really lovely, and I had this weird sense of loyalty to Simon & Schuster, even though nothing had happened yet, and I didn't have my agent yet. It was just before, and I wish she'd been there then in those conversations, because she'd have probably pulled me back and been like, it's business, it's not friendship, you don't owe anything to anybody. And maybe we'd have even gone on general submission. So I don't regret anything, because I think, well, what's happened, but she would have stopped me getting in that situation, which was so deeply stressful. I was so worried that Simon & Schuster were going to find out I was talking to this other editor and pull the deal, which they wouldn't have, but
and they also wouldn't have minded, actually.
No, I just think it's so scary when you have got your dream kind of being handed to you after years of kind of working for it. You're terrified to do anything wrong. And having an agent obviously stops you getting in those situations, because they are there to guide you, rather than you being allowed to kind of make all this havoc, sending people things on email unofficially. But I actually don't have an agent now. I left Kate last year, so I do plan to get an agent again in the future, but I've had kind of a year and a bit agent free, which is quite interesting, because I've done both sides of it now.
Do you mind talking to us a little bit about that decision?
Not at all.
You've moved publishers, and you've now changed your agent, or you've moved away from your agent.
So
What?
I only had a one book deal with Simon and Schuster. So when that came to an end, and I'll be completely frank, it wasn't a great deal for me. It was, in hindsight, it just wasn't good. There wasn't a lot of promotion. The idea was that it was going to launch their crime and thriller digital originals list, which they have a romance list, which they've always done digitally, and then done a paperback after. And it's been hugely successful. There's some really good household names that have come up through that scheme. So obviously I thought the crime and thriller will go that same way. For whatever reason, it didn't. And there, from the outside, I mean, you never know what's going on. It didn't look like they put a lot of resource in that, and they don't seem to have signed a lot of, if any, authors after that first year. So I think it was kind of one of these ideas they had, which never took off. My editor isn't there anymore. So it was quite a flat launch. Like, I never even got a paperback, which a lot of people don't realize, because I really tried to not make that the story about my book, because I just thought people would think it was rubbish if they knew that they never put it out in paperback.
Do you think it matters to have a paperback?
Hugely. It was so difficult not having a paperback, and I was very aware quite early on that if people knew that straight up, they would. I did get some people, be once they realized, have no interest in interviewing me for blogs, for podcasts, anything. Festivals wouldn't touch me. So yes, it was huge not having a paperback. And also from like a morale thing of not being able to, that moment when you feel your book and you see it, even if the paperback sales aren't great, I think there is something about, for me, not having that book. It still upsets me that that book doesn't exist in the world in a paperback form. And I hope one day maybe I'll get the rights back and do something with it myself, or sell it to someone else, because it's really hard for people. Like, a lot of people don't read ebooks still. They don't have an interest in ebooks. Like, I mean, maybe it's older people, but like a lot of family friends and people like that, they just couldn't get their head around it. My auntie, who's mad, actually rang up the Simon and Schuster office without me knowing, saying to them, could you just print me one copy? They must have thought she was insane. I was absolutely mortified. She said, I don't mind paying for it. I can't read Kindles. I don't have one. I really want my niece's book. Just print me one. And I was like, oh my Lord. But yeah, it was a blocker. It was definitely a blocker. So that I didn't get offered another deal with them, to be completely frank. It wasn't a choice. I probably wouldn't have wanted one anyway, just because it wasn't what I'd hoped it would be. And then I moved to Hera when we did go out on general submission. Kate took me on general submission. I got that first 2-book deal through her, and then 2-book deal on my own.
And so I'm curious, because there are quite a few. So Hera, right? It's Hera, who's now owned by Canelo.
Yes.
Who have also now been taken over by DK. There's a lot of eating of other businesses in publishing. But Hera are digital first as well?
Well, they're actually not. Everyone thinks they are, but they're not. They are a 50-50 split between digital and print. And actually, all my income has always followed that path of kind of 50% of it has come from print sales. I used to call them digital first, until I asked them to a digital first event once, and they said, thank you, but we're not digital first. And I was like, oh, it's embarrassing. But I think they are more known in the digital arena, yeah.
And I wonder, just in that whole process of going out on submission, there are quite a few of these sort of smaller publishers who focus on genre, so like romance and thriller and crime. I think I'm thinking of Storm. Who else is out there? I know that Bonnier had a subdivision, an imprint like that as well. I'm forgetting the really famous one, the one that's quite well known for its data points. But I wonder if you have any assessment on these smaller publishing houses, and I don't know, anything that you think they do very well.
I mean, we talk, because my colleague,
Bookouture, that's it, Bookouture.
Becca Day, she's a digital author, and we write in the same arena, and her publisher focuses far more on digital than mine does, and her digital sales are good, very, very good. She's been published really well, and we talk quite a lot, because we obviously, in our job, we interview people from the publishers as well, and I think a lot of Bookouture, and I think a lot of Boldwood particularly, they're quite exciting, kind of coming up. And some of the stuff.
Do you say Boldwood?
Boldwood, yeah.
I've not heard of them.
They're really, really worth watching. They I mean, what they've done with Laura Pearson, who's a women's fiction author, she had a few books published with a really small publisher, and beautiful writing. She's a really incredible writer, but it just never really took off. The publisher was too small, and they picked up the rights to all of her books, and she wrote new books for them. And I think she's just surpassed, I literally saw it on Twitter today. It's somewhere near to 500,000 sales. And her career has just gone from one extreme to the other, and she's having a really good time with them. But they're doing that for quite a lot of authors. They just seem kind of, those are the two main people I would think of, is Bookouture and Boldwood. If you were going to go, if you're very genre focused and you can write quite fast, they would always be my top picks.
Interesting. Any sort of advice for someone who might be thinking about working with such publishing houses? What's the best way to get the most out of that relationship?
I think be realistic about what you can achieve, because so many people will say, I'll write as many books as you want me to. And it's really hard. It's if you are lucky enough that you're going to be able to give up your job, which most people aren't, it is a very difficult thing. You are going to have two jobs with competing deadlines, and it's going to be something you really care about. And that's really, really difficult. And I think just look at what that publisher is offering you and don't get swept away like I did. And I still don't regret it, because at the end of the day, my book got published. It got me to where I am now. But I could probably have got a better deal with my first book if I just held on a bit longer and not felt like, oh, someone wants me finally. That's where I'm going to go. And I do think that's so difficult when all you want is for someone to pick your book up. People can get quite carried away with just the dream of it. And I always say to people, like, really think about what you want, because for some people, having their book on a table in Waterstones is the ultimate goal. So is your publisher going to do that? Because Boldwood, Bookouture, they might sell millions of copies. You're not going to be in a bookstore like Waterstones, probably. I mean, the chances are very, very small, but you might be a Kindle bestseller. But it's those sorts of things that you don't really know a lot of the time until you're published. And if your goal is to have a hardback and to have these big fancy launches, then you don't want to go digital first. If your goal is to sell thousands of copies and make a really decent living, and you're not really fussed about having people like falling over you and having tube campaigns and all the kind of fancy stuff people see that isn't necessarily equating to sales, then you're probably going to be really happy with digital or a really small indie publisher. Like my publisher now, they're very caring. It feels like a grown-up relationship where we work together, and they are fully appreciative of the time limits I have and the effort I put in. And they listen to my opinion because they're small. So they don't have these kind of big overarching targets or someone over their shoulder telling them what they can and can't do. And with a big publisher, that can be really different, as you'll know. So there's lots of pros and cons. People often think small means bad, and it really doesn't. It's just a different world, I think.
It's a really good point about that stock difference. There's the fancier stuff, as you say, or the sort of things that are for show, maybe for other people. And then there are the actual results of sales, money in your pocket.
Yeah. Really like Bookouture is such a good example of loads of their authors, probably not household names in terms of if you went to kind of non-writer friends, they might not know them, but those people can be selling like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of copies and making a really nice living. And I think that's what sometimes people have to get over and think, well, what do I actually want? And I always say this to people, because like with self-publishing, people often turn their nose up at it, but it very much depends on what you want, of what's your overall goal. If you're someone who really loves managing their own career, maybe you love marketing, you love self-promotion, and you're quite happy to go out and pay for the best editors, like that's a great route for you. If you're someone who really loves having control, traditional publishing you might find quite difficult, because you are essentially creating a product, giving that product to the person who's selling it, and then you back off. And that's what I think people don't necessarily expect and can get a little bit upset about in the early days, like not being able to choose their own cover, things like that.
Can I ask, so you've written 4 books, we're going to go into them in just a moment. How much work have you had to do in the marketing? And what has worked?
I did a lot of marketing for my debut, mostly because I enjoyed it. It was lockdown, I didn't have a lot else to do, couldn't go anywhere, and it was my first book, so it was really fun and I really loved that. And I knew that I was on a very small deal, and once I realized they weren't doing a paperback, I thought, okay, I don't think they're going to do anything. And they didn't really. They did a couple of things, but really, oh sorry, I'm going to make sure my phone's off. They just didn't do as much as you would want someone to do with your book. So things like bloggers, like I was saying, it's hard not having a physical proof. At the time, bloggers were getting sent a lot of packs in the post, and it was quite a big thing to be posting stuff on blog tours. I'd already had a blogger be a bit sniffy about me not having a paperback and them saying, oh, I'm not going to read anything digitally. And I thought, how am I going to get people over the fact that I'm not a proper book, as people kept telling me. So I thought I'd make up these little marketing packs. And my husband's quite creative and we're quite happy to do stuff. So the front cover of All My Lies is a bottle of wine. So we went and bought lots of little bottles of wine, and we printed out a book cover. So we had branded bottles of wine. And then we made up little packs for bloggers with a little letter, poster. I can't remember what else it had. I remember the one, I'm not sure what else it had in. Basically saying, thank you for reading my book. Because I thought, they post the books, they make these beautiful spreads. I don't have a book. They're not going to have anything to photograph, therefore they're not going to be interested. And then suddenly all of these little packs were picturing up on social media because people thought they were real books. They were just postcards.
How many did you do of those?
Probably 30, not loads.
That's still a lot of work, actually. That's a really good idea.
Yeah. And Summer Schuster were good because I made the packs up, but I sent them to their post office and they then managed kind of the sending them out. But it had the impact also of other authors thought that that's Simon & Schuster doing it for me. So suddenly I look like a big deal, and I wasn't I was the least thing, like I was so far from a big deal. It's untrue, but a lot of people said to me like, oh, your debut did really well. I'm like, if you'd seen my sale figures. But
isn't that interesting though? The perception of other people on how well your book is doing is based on such superficial things.
It was all like, and I did write a blog, I wrote a Substack about it a couple of months ago, just like about Razzle Dazzle and this whole thing of, I just created the illusion of being really successful because I knew that no one else was going to do it for me, and I don't regret any of it, and I really did enjoy it. I didn't carry on doing that because it was exhausting, and I feel like I learned where can my energy go, and there was only so long you can keep up that level of like drumming up this support and making it feel really impressive. But I didn't need to with Hera. Like I could get away with not really doing anything with Hera and it would be fine. And to be honest, I don't do a lot of marketing now. I really don't have time. But also when you've got a publisher who's doing the stuff for you, I feel like there's less pressure on you to be kind of slogging your guts out, making hundreds of packs for bloggers and things like that.
So if there's an author here who's thinking either there's a book coming out or they have a book out, what would you say, and this is just your subjective opinion, what are the essential things they should consider for their public facing platforms, whether it's Substack or Twitter or Instagram?
I think like, don't forget the basics. People get really caught up on kind of PR and this sort of thing. And you think, well, do you have a website that has your photo, that has your bio, that has your contact details and has a link to buy your book? Because if someone Googles you, that's what they want to see. If someone is running a festival and they're thinking about booking you, if they're looking at a podcast, they just need very quickly to get your information. If you are someone who does want to get booked for festivals and speaking gigs, if I went on your Instagram, could I see you speaking to an audience? And that's like at Jericho, we book a lot of people, and it's often what me and Becca will sit and do. We will look on people's Instagram because it's hard to know if you're a good public speaker, if you don't have your face on camera ever, if you don't talk into the camera. And you don't have to be a good public speaker, but a lot of people really want to get booked for events and they don't understand why they're not getting booked. And it can be as basic as that. So always share links to your books. There's things like Linktree, which are a really easy thing you can put on social media that you can just almost acts like a landing page basically for a website. So you can just put the links to your books in. Don't be spammy. I think the worst thing you see with social media is people who suddenly panic that they've got a book to promote and they just start, buy my book, buy my book, buy my book. It doesn't really work like that. It has, you'll know really well, like in a community, you have to be part of that community before you ask them to do something for you. And I think for me, I use Twitter a lot. I've always used Twitter and I really like it. So it's never really felt like I'm using Twitter to sell, but I know a lot of people buy my books because they know me from Twitter, because I've always been on it. I mean, I don't kind of spam people. I don't just constantly ask them to do things. But I think people get very worried about the marketing aspect as well. And I think just dialing it right back to, can people find you online? Can they find information about your books? Are you telling people what your books are about? If you can get that right from a basic point of view, that's probably enough.
Yeah, some really good points. And I second what you say on having reels or pieces of you talking publicly, because even when we're booking in writers to interview, I'll often look and see what else have they said elsewhere. Like, what do they talk about? What are their interests?
Yeah.
How do they come across?
It is a big thing, because you can be an amazing writer, but some people aren't great at public speaking, or they're not, like, if, like, for us particularly, obviously we're in the same sort of thing as you, of like giving people advice about writing. Like, if we see a writer who's never written anything about their writing process, you think, oh, they're probably not quite right. And people are very interested in writing processes. Things like Substack are really great for building a community as well. It's like a newsletter kind of blogging platform. It's very easy. I'm very lazy with mine. I set one up last year saying I'd write every month, and I've probably sent out 5. But if you like that sort of thing, it can be really nice.
Yeah, it's quite, Substack is definitely quite popular in the community. I'd love to turn to your book. So, we talked about your first book, All My Lies, that came out in 21. And then since then, you've written another 3. So Keep Them Close, If They Knew, and your latest one, What Stays Unsaid. So first of all, how would you describe your books? How would you categorize your books?
Psychological thrillers, I think.
And do your publishers use the same labels? And I ask because sometimes people will interchange crime, thriller.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes
psychological suspense.
Thriller, but I think if you're looking for like a really thrillery thriller, they're not going to appeal. Like, if I'm talking to people informally, I always say they're psychological thrillers that you could almost be women's fiction if you took out a few elements. Because they're usually very focused on like family and relationships more than the crimes are kind of incidental. So if you're looking for that kind of big detective story, that's not what you'll find in my books.
And just out of curiosity, how do you compare your books? We talk about comp titles and query letters. What are your comparisons?
Ooh, that's good. What's it say on the back of this book? Well, this is a really nice one. I don't know if you can see on camera. So this is my last book, and the comp titles for that are fans of Lisa Jewell and Adele Parks, which are 2 of my absolute favorite authors. That would be, if someone ever thought that was similar to my books, that would make me very, very happy.
Can we talk about the cadence of your books? So you've written 4 books in around 4 years, or published 4 books in 4 years. Is that because you felt a pressure? Is there a pressure to like keep producing year on year to build your list, or is it just you naturally felt like writing about these ideas?
So my second book, I had basically taken all the advice everyone gives you, which is while your debut's being submitted and yada yada, write that second book and don't just sit and wait. So I was quite lucky that by the time All My Lies was published, I think the second book, which is Keep Them Close, I think that was basically written. And then that went out on Sub in November, and I'd already started writing the third one, If They Knew, when that went out on Sub. So I got my deal with Hera in November 2021, I think. Is that right? Yeah. And then they wanted to publish 2 in really quick succession, which in hindsight, I wouldn't have been able to do in a normal year. And just to be really frank, I was having a really bad personal time that year. We had a lot of really big losses, some just not very nice things. And actually, what I know now, which I didn't realize at the time, was that the writing was just the thing in my life I could control. And actually, when I look back and think, how did I write 2 books in 1 year, edit 1 book and write another book to a really demanding schedule, I couldn't do it now. And it gave me a really false sense of how fast I wrote, because I can write really fast, but I would never repeat that again. Never. It wasn't healthy. And I think if I had been in a normal state, it wouldn't have happened. So I've got this kind of weird publishing track of publishing 2 really closely together, because I think they were out within 4 months of each other, which was mad and not actually very good in sales. It was a strategy that didn't really pay off, actually. And then my next one was a year and a bit after that, I think. Yeah, because it was November 2022, and then my next one was May 2024. Yeah, which is quite weird. And then my next one, which I'm just editing now, is out in April 2025. And then I would like a break, because you asking like if it was a natural thing of just desperately wanting to get them out, not really. It was a case of I was asked to, so I did. And I actually can't believe that I'm 5 books in by the time it's out in 4 years.
And what advice are you hearing from your agent or from your previous agent and your current publisher on a cadence that they think works for the market?
I mean, my publisher now says that what one a year, because they used to always want more than one a year. Like they usually would want 1.5 a year, basically one every 9. I can't remember the exact thing, but they've said one a year is fine now. But I think they probably would like me to do faster. It's just because I keep going, I can't. I don't really know. I was talking to someone earlier in the week actually about they've been talking to Bookouture, and they said that they're more open to one a year now, because it used to be that places like Bookouture would always want 2 minimum a year, which put a lot of people off. And places like Boldwood, I think some of their success comes from buying up people who do have a big backlist, so it looks like they're producing kind of like 4 books a year, but actually they're older books that have been written. I I wouldn't want to do it again, to be publishing as fast as I have. I even think one a year is actually really difficult if you're working, because it's one a year, but you've got to write and edit at the same time, which for me, I find quite difficult as well when I'm in a book, to be jumping back and forth between them.
So you write psychological thrillers. What is it about that genre that meets your needs as a writer, do you think?
I really love writing about kind of just like family relationships and the things that you can be pushed to do, the normal things. Like I love a really normal situation that is, you've got this kind of moral dilemma. Like I love Gillian McAllister. I think she's probably the queen of that moral dilemma kind of thriller, where you can really picture yourself in that situation. I think that's what often makes a really good book, not something that you kind of, for me, like with the Harlan Coben thing, obviously they're brilliant books for a lot of people, they're selling a lot of books, but you're never that protagonist, you're never in those situations, you don't have a friend with a helicopter who's going to come and save you. I really like the ones where you really feel like, oh, this could be me if it was a slightly different situation. And I think thrillers really do allow you to do that, of kind of have the big drama, but really be based firmly in reality.
Quite like a friend who has a helicopter.
I'd love a friend
who can rescue you. So your latest book is What Stays Unsaid, and it's about a hen do that goes awry. Can you tell us about your story?
Yeah, so it's a multi-point of view story. We've got the main characters Alex and Millie, and we both taken on a surprise weekend away to a remote cottage in Dartmoor, where their friends have been friends for their whole lives, and they think it's going to be amazing to get them there for this joint hen do. And then they realise that the 2 best friends actually haven't spoken for a long time and are not friends, and do not want to tell the rest of the group why or what's happened. And then obviously various things happen over the course of the weekend. We're kind of stuck in the house with them on the stormy parts of Dartmoor Hills.
So if you're up for it, I'd like to just go through that writing process for you for this story. So maybe we start with, when did this idea come to you? What was the...
I've always thought I'd write about a hen do. I've been on loads of hen do's. I think I counted when I was writing something for the book, and I think it was 12 hen do's in maybe 6 years. And I think people are sent quite bonkers on hen do's. I just think it brings out the absolute worst in people. You think you know someone, and you go on their hen do and you're like, oh, okay, this is different. And I just thought, I've got to one day write about a hen do. Because I just thought that's...
Can you explain what a hen do is for anyone who's listening, especially in America?
Yes, it would be a bachelorette party in America. In the UK, they tend to now be gone from like this one night out with everybody into these kind of really grand affairs where big houses are rented, and you have activity spreadsheets for kind of 3 days on end, and a WhatsApp group where you're constantly asked for money for random things for weeks and weeks ahead of time. And I just think that there's something really fun about that situation. So I was quite lucky in a way, and then also regressed it in the end of when I re-signed with Hera without my agent. They said, oh, we want to re-sign you, so just send us some ideas. And I had a document of about 10 different ideas, and I'd put them in the order of the one I wanted to write most to the one I wanted to write the least. Not wanted to write the least, but had no thoughts beyond a 1-line pitch. And they chose the 2 I hadn't really thought out at all. The first one being the hen do book. And the only pitch, I can't remember the exact pitch, but it was basically that of a surprise, two brides are taken on a surprise weekend away and they're not talking. And that was kind of the whole thing. And then I thought, oh God, I'm now contracted to write a book that's due in like 6 months that I have not got any plot for whatsoever. So then I had to quickly try and plot it.
So yeah, so what is your next step? Do you start with a plot? Do you ideate for a while? Do you write a little
I
bit?
have to have a plot. I always have to start with a plot. I think because I have now got to write to very tight deadlines, I know I have to have a plot. Otherwise, I'm just going to write. I used to, with the 2 books before they were in contract, I would write a book and then scrap it and start again, which is lovely if you've got time. It's not lovely if you don't have time. So I knew I couldn't do that. So I usually start with kind of characters, like what sort of people would be in this situation, like two friends who've had a fallout, but why don't they want to tell their other friends that they're not talking? Why would their friends react quite badly to it? What sort of friendship group would exist that it would be such a big deal that this relationship at the centre had broken down? And then I just kind of start going back from there. And I really like writing about high school friendships and the things that happen to you as teenagers and how they shape you.
And so are you sort of brainstorming with yourself all the possibilities of, say, there's two characters, Millie and Alex, and they're close friends, and then you have to figure out why they're not talking on this hen do. How are you coming up with their personalities and the big secrets that they're hiding from each other?
I usually have like a bit of a sketch of the sort of person I want to write, the sort of person I'm interested in, and then I honestly can't, I'm trying to remember how I came up with most of the ideas for that. And I usually just think, well, what sort of person would react like that? So usually you're going to have this relationship with two friends where you've got kind of the bolshier one, the bossier one, the more timid one. And like I was really interested in what happens with friendships when you're friends since you're very young and when you're not really allowed to grow up. Like I used to have a very close group of friends who I grew up with, and what I found with that was the personality you had as a child, it doesn't matter how much you change as an adult, you're still that person in that friendship group, much like you are with family. Like I'm in my family, I'm like the party irresponsible one because I'm the youngest, but I'm not that at all. But it doesn't matter because that's what I was as a child. And I think that's the same with, in my experience, female friendships, if you have them very young. And it really thinking about that, that's kind of what I really wanted to write about. Why do female friends often bring out the worst in each other when they've known each other so long, and why is it so hard to let go of a friendship even when you know it's not very good for you?
So you have the plot, you started writing. How long did that first draft take you?
I think it was quite quick. I think it was about 5 months, but I only really write 1 day a week, so I am a very fast writer because I really like life. I always say this, like a lot of writers, they will stay up all night writing and they'll give up all their weekends. And I love writing, not above having a life and seeing my friends and my family. So I don't work a Monday out for Jericho. That's my writing day. And I really try and keep my writing to that 1 day. It's very, very rare that I will be disappearing for the whole weekend and not going out and enjoying myself to write. So 5 months, but I would have probably got it done if I was writing a few days a week, probably much quicker. But my writing schedule when I'm writing a draft is usually to try and get 5,000 words a week done, with 3,500 words done on my day off, and then 500 words done every day just before work, which is usually quite manageable.
And do you edit as you write, or do you just write and then edit later?
Yeah, I just have to write. One of the things I was taught, I can't remember who it was by, someone on a writing course told me that this method of really simple, but if you get, so what often happens is why people go back and edit, we found is that they go, oh, I have to because, I don't know, Millie, I'm trying to think of a random example. This doesn't happen in the book, but Millie's dead and now I've got her alive and I need to kill her. So people will just then go, oh, I have to go back and make her dead from the start, when actually if you just writing as if Millie is dead, and then you know that everything from that point on, Millie is dead. I've mentally parked it, told myself where I need to go back and kill her from, and now I can, and that really works for me. I have it all the time. I change people's names, I change where they're from, and just a mental thing of being able to put a pin in it and tell myself I know I'm gonna, otherwise I won't get to the end, otherwise I'll just faff with the edits and I will never reach the end.
And then once you've written that first draft, how do you go back and edit it? What are you looking for? Do you have any sort of methods or techniques that work for you?
Yeah, so it's very boring, but I have a spreadsheet method that I use. The first thing I do is convert it into a Word, because I write on Scrivener, make it into a Word file, do all the layouts, all that boring stuff. I send it to my Kindle, and then I read it on my Kindle so it feels like a book. And then I have a spreadsheet, and for every chapter I'll have who the point of view is from, where we are in, like, literally location where we are, time period, what happens in the scene, literally the action, and then what we find out during the scene. So I'll read the entire book and list out chapter by chapter what happens. So I've got this kind of blueprint. If I've been really good during the drafting process in Scrivener, that's really easy because I'll have written it up, but mostly I haven't. So that doesn't take that long, and I quite enjoy that. And then I will go back and I will have another column of what do I need to change in this chapter. So rather than it feeling like I've got an entire book to edit, I can just see, right, in this chapter, this is what happens and this is what needs to happen instead. So I'm quite methodical with those early edits. Those are probably my favorite. That used to be my big panic moment where I just had a meltdown and didn't know what to do. And I feel like I've got a method now which works. It's later for me where I have the meltdown now.
And at what point are you sharing your draft with an agent or a publisher or a beta reader?
Because I'm always so late now, it's literally like the last two books, I've had to share them as soon as I've written them, which I don't love, but I haven't just not had time. I've just not had time to fit things in. I think actually that's not true. I think this last book I gave myself 30 days from finishing the very, very first draft to handing it in. So that was that process where I went through and did the chapter edits, but they're still pretty light. I've been told I write quite clean first drafts, so it's not quite as horrifying as it seems. They don't feel that clean to me, but because I'm usually on quite a tight deadline, I just don't have the luxury of making it as perfect as I'd like it.
Now, you write in this particular book, you have multiple points of view, so you're flitting between the different characters. I think it's a lot like One of Us Is Lying, like Karen, I've forgotten the name.
I've watched the TV show of that, but I've not read it.
Multiple points of view. So yeah, you have multiple points of view. And I read somewhere that you had advice about making sure that you focus on the characters that had the most at stake. Can you tell us a little bit about how you went about editing the different points of view to bring together this point of tension?
Yeah, that was advice from my editor Jenny, actually, which was such good advice. Because it was the first I'd written from 2 points of view before, but not 5. And it was quite difficult. That's where the spreadsheet really did come into its own, just having a drop down of who each point of view was and seeing, did I have enough from any one person or did I have too much? Like, you're always going to have your main characters, but you still don't want them to have like when in a multiple point of view, you don't want them to have 90% of the narrative. I had to do quite a lot of work on making voices distinct because Jenny, my editor, also said you want to be able to pick up the book anywhere and know who you're reading from, which is quite difficult, especially like on a Hendu where they've all grown up in the same area. They've all got relatively the same backgrounds. They're kind of there's not huge distinctions between the women as you often find in friendship groups. So that I did find quite tricky, and trying to learn kind of like speech patterns and the way they felt about themselves and each other. And I would always that advice about who's got most to lose. There was a lot of chapters I rewrote completely. Of one point it was from this person, then it was from another person. It was really interesting actually, because you're kind of seeing it from one corner of the room with one viewpoint on it. And then it's quite a good way, I think, to write scenes because you've got a much more rounded view of what's actually happening. But it was quite, that was the hardest thing about writing that book, of really thinking, have I got these voices right? Have I not written 5 of the exact same women?
What do you think makes a good psychological thriller? What should a psychological thriller have in it?
I think you have the kind of internal and external stakes have to be really high. So quite often kind of advice we give to people is the external factor they think is enough. So like there's a terrorist bomb gone off, obviously everyone's going to die. You're a police officer, you know there's a terrorist bomb going to go off, you've got 12 hours to stop it. Those are obviously big external stakes, but why is it that character's story to tell? Because anyone could tell that story. What's that person got to say about that incident? What's their personal stake in it that makes it more interesting? Because that's when you've got high stakes and the right viewpoint of what will that character react differently or more interesting. Like if you're a mum having her child abducted, the first thing in a normal world, a normal character is going to do is ring the police. If your character is terrified of the police and has agoraphobia, so they can't go outside and they will not ring the police and they have to find their child, that is a different and more interesting story than the other million missing children stories that we're reading all the time. So when you've got that character element in it, and they don't have to be that agoraphobia, which is very like, it doesn't have to be this quirky, strange thing, but they're really honed down on, why am I telling it from this character's point of view and not the 100 other people that are going to be impacted in some way by this story?
Now, you talked about plotting earlier. You talked about how you like to plot before you start. Now, going back to writing a psychological thriller, are you plotting the entire structure and thinking about the sort of set pieces that you want in your thriller? And are you doing that chapter by chapter or just by acts?
Yeah, I do try and do chapter by chapter. So I often, like, there's a method, I call it the Disney method. I don't know if it's called that, but it's like, it's a because of that scenario. So my first book, the biggest problem was that I didn't have any sense of cause and effect. So things just happened because I wanted them to happen. So now I do really try, and every chapter has to start with a because of that this happens, and because of that, and that's where I finish the chapter. So you've got this constantly spiraling sequence of events. So it can't, if you've got anything that goes and then this happens, you haven't got that cause and effect quite right. You need that because of that this is happening. So like in my first book, I had them randomly going for a trip, a hotel trip, and it didn't have any impact on the plot. It was just, I wanted to show something about their relationship, but it didn't move anything forward. And that was, and if I'd written that in a structure, it would have been, you know, her lover goes missing and then she goes to the Cotswolds for a hotel trip. And it's like, well, no, if because of that, she goes and tells the police, because of that, blah, blah, blah. And it's just that way of trying to really tightly plot everything happening in a sequence. So I do try and do it chapter by chapter, but I wouldn't say that I'm an excellent plotter in terms of, often, and this is what I found with selling those books on the pitch and then their synopsis, things can sound really tight in a synopsis, and then you go to write it and you're like, it doesn't make any sense that the character would do that. It just wouldn't happen. So as much as I have a plan, I do veer off it a lot. And mostly no one's ever told me off yet, but it's hard not to do that, I think.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. I've noticed a lot of writers say that, talk about that, having a plan but being okay with moving away from it.
Yeah, flexible.
And it strikes me that so much, particularly in your book, so much of the tension lies in what's not being said. And we're turning the pages to find out what they're hiding. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you think about holding back, about what not to say in order to cause that tension.
I find that hard. I find, because the worst thing is when you're holding something back purely for the reader, like it has to fit with the character. So I think readers can get really frustrated when they see like, well, that wouldn't, if someone's saying, well, that would never happen because the person would just tell them. And that's when you really get into that character work for me. Like, I'm not one of these writers who's very character first, and people say, oh, the character just leads. But I am very much of, I don't know, if there's a secret and the person can't say, like, why wouldn't they say? What would be in their background that would, that example of someone not just phoning the police when their child goes missing? What would have had to happen to that character to make that a completely rational response? And I think that when you're kind of withholding stuff is really important to make sure you know why the character is withholding or why you're withholding as a writer. And it can't just be because you want it to be shocking later on. It has to feel quite natural, and that can be really hard to get right.
This has been really fun talking to you about the craft. I'd love to talk a little bit about Jericho Writers, the thing you do the rest of the week. So somewhere along this way, you talked about how you started working for Jericho Writers. Can you tell us a little bit about Jericho and how you got involved?
Yeah, so Jericho Writers has been going a long time, I think around 20 years. So our founder, Harry Bingham, set it up. He's an author, and he basically just wanted to earn a bit more money and offered editing services. A lot of his friends are authors and editors, and they started doing editing services for writers. And it's just grown from that, really. We offer everything that a writer hopefully could need. Our goal is to just help people write their books. People like talk about us a lot as if we focus on the publishing industry. We have a lot of links to the publishing industry. We know a lot of agents. We do a lot of events. but we're not just there for people who want to get traditionally published. Like, we do stuff with self-publishing. We have people who just go, I just want to write a book so that my grandchildren can read it. Like, our goal really is to make sure people get whatever they want out of writing. And we always say achieve your goals, but your goal doesn't have to be a 6-figure big advance and giving up your day job. Your goal could be as simple as, I want to finish my book and be proud of it. So we work with writers in all sorts of capacities. We do events like this. We do, our favourite thing is our London Festival of Writing, which used to be up in York but moved to London a couple of years ago. So it's a weekend event with speakers from all over, authors, agents, publishers, just doing workshops. And there's about 300 to 400 writers who come and spend the weekend with us, which is really lovely, because obviously our lives are mostly on screen, and it's just so nice to get out and meet people in the real world. And we have people flying all over the world, which is incredible. Like, there's nothing more fun than thinking that someone is kind of making a trip over, where someone come from New Zealand this year. And I just think that's amazing.
Incredible. And what's your role at Jericho?
So I'm the managing director. I've been doing that for just over a year, actually. I originally joined as the head of marketing, which is a very lofty title because marketing was me. And I then we grew a lot over COVID. And I hired a marketing team, built that marketing team up. And then, like last year, Harry wanted to step down a little bit and needed someone to run the day-to-day business. So that's what I do now. So I love it. I really, really love it. We've got a really lovely team. We've got a couple of authors on the staff. Everyone is a big reader. A lot of people are trying to get published on the staff as well. It's just a really, really nice team.
And actually, how just to get a sense of the size, how big is the Jericho team?
I think there's about 14 of us who are kind of the main office team. But then we have 80 or so editors, mentors, tutors, and then hundreds of people we use freelance. But yeah, the core team is about 14 of us.
And actually, someone's asked in the chat, do you ever look for freelancers? Are you on the lookout for proofreaders?
Yeah, I don't know if we're actively looking at the moment, but we do always recruit, because we do sell a lot of those services. So on our website, if you go on, I think it's on our About Us page, and scroll to the bottom, there's a form saying, are you interested in working with us? And that's where there'll be a series of questions if you're an editor, or you want to do events, or you're an author and you kind of want to come to the festival, things like that. So yeah, we do always, I don't know how many new people they're taking on at the moment, because that's my colleagues' team, but definitely worth popping an email in, and when they get enough work, they always go out.
Thank you. Now, you're a writer, you said your team also writes, and you've watched thousands of writers pass through Jericho. What do you think separates the writers, just from your experience, what separates the writers who achieve their writing goals from the ones who struggle to achieve their writing goals?
I really think it's two things, which a writing coach once said that I had bounce back ability, which I quite like. Just perseverance, the ability to have a knockback and not let it ruin you. And that is so hard with writing any creative endeavor. Like, you've put your heart and soul into it. And some people find it really hard to get back up once they've had a few knocks. And flexibility. So what I think often really trips people up is an inability to know when to park something. And perseverance doesn't mean I'm going to just write the same book again and again and again, and no matter what advice people give to me, I'm going to stick to my guns. You have to be able to say, you know what, I've done my best, this book's going to go in a drawer and I'm going to move on to my next one. Or you have to be able to say, actually, I'm writing, I don't know, something which actually no one wants to buy from a commercial space, and I want a commercial deal. And this is what we see a lot of people go, no, I really want to be published and sell thousands of copies, but I'm also really interested in writing this really niche subject that no one wants to buy. And it's like they're competing wants. And it might be that you can do both of those things. You can sell your niche little book to an indie publisher, be very happy. If you still want that big commercial deal, you need to be serious about writing something that a large amount of people want to read. But for the biggest thing, I think, is just being able to kind of roll with the punches and not get too disheartened. And it's a really disheartening business. No matter how successful you are, people at all levels really, really struggle with the reality of writing versus what the dream is. And the reality is often quite boring. I mean, writing's lovely, but when you've been doing it for hours on end and you haven't left the house all day and you're not got any colleagues who you're talking to, like this, that's quite if you offered that any other job, it can be quite boring sometimes. And I think people have a really romantic view of what happens once you get published, which can knock people when they finally achieve that goal. And I think as long as you can enjoy your successes and not diminish anything, so really celebrate, like if you've won a short story competition, that's incredible. If you've finished your book, that's incredible. Like really take that joy through writing, because as soon as you start going, oh, I've won this competition but it's only small, or I've sold a book but it's only one, that's just a negative kind of way to see it. And you have to be able to celebrate the big things, the small things, and think of them as big, because you're going to get a lot of knocks, and that even people who've sold thousands of books will still go, yeah, but I don't have it on Netflix. And it's like that you're never going to be happy if you always want something more, like always be ambitious, but also kind of accept that there's lots of really positive things on the way. And I always say, like, writing, I mean, I'm not a huge seller, like I'm not raking it in with my writing, but writing completely changed my life. Like I would not have my job at Jericho if I hadn't written a book. My three of my best friends in the world I know from writing. Loads of my really close friends are people I know through writing. So I just think, yes, I'm not quite where I want to be yet. Like I'm not, Netflix aren't knocking at my door. I'm not in the selling millions of copies, but like I've built a life based on writing. And I think that's incredible. And I'm hoping that that means that all of the huge successes, the Netflixes, all those things, maybe they'll come later on. But even if they don't, that's a huge win for me that I couldn't have done if I wasn't writing.
Especially I love what you say about celebrating the small wins. I think of Mary Oliver's quote about don't make joy a crumb.
Oh, I like that. I haven't heard that.
She has a poem about that. And so, you know, we both run creative communities. I'm curious, and you know, it's a wonderful thing to do, and I feel very lucky just to be around writers. I think writers are some of they are my favorite people. It's just something about the energy they bring to the world and actually what they contribute. But it's also challenging. It can be challenging to run a community, just from an administrative point of view, personal energy point of view, and also the challenges. So I'm just curious, as the MD of Jericho, what kind of challenges are you grappling with? Whatever you're comfortable sharing.
I think one of the biggest things is that we're selling things to people that are their heart and their soul, and particularly with editorial services, we always, I wouldn't say we try not to sell them, but we're quite picky when someone comes to us and says they want an editorial service. I want a manuscript assessment. We say, have you finished your book? Have you edited your book? Have you done as much as you can with it? Because what we find is if someone's just come to us for a quick fix and they think, oh, I'm just going to pay however amount it is to get an editor's assessment, they're going to come back and tell me it's brilliant and I can go off and get it published. And it doesn't work like that. That you're coming to us when you've done everything you can, and then we're giving you feedback. And often that feedback isn't, this is amazing, you should go out and get a publishing deal. Because if that was the feedback, you'd have wasted your however much money you've spent. And it's really hard to deal with people's emotions, because a lot of the time people come back and they say, I'm really, really unhappy about this. It's not fair. I don't think that you've read it properly. And then we say, okay, let's give it a bit of a cool down period. And they go, actually, a few weeks later, yeah, the editor was right. I didn't want to rewrite the book. I didn't want to hear that the point of view wasn't working, but it has. And that's really, really difficult, because we're selling stuff. And I always say selling it, like, it doesn't feel right for what we're doing, but we're not selling a t-shirt where if you put it on and you don't like it, you have it back. Like, some people don't want to hear that their book needs work. And I totally get the reaction. The festival is really hard because we do one-to-ones with agents, and people often come up to us, and we have now like a designated staff that I call the crying staff, for when people have had these feedbacks and they're upset. And it used to be that people get, like, the staff, oh, it's horrible, I really don't like, they're upset. I said, they're upset now. In a few days, it's going to feel different. And I know, because I've done all of those things. I remember a one-to-one I had at Lucy Cavendish Festival, which is the one where the editor said to me, you don't know what genre you're writing. And I didn't. But at the time, that was horrifying, because I'd gone, like everybody goes, believing nothing good would happen, yet also having a belief that this might be the one thing that got my book published. And at the back of everyone's mind when they do things like this is the idea that we're keeping this one thing from them. That it's just really hard. You're balancing, I'm sure you get it as well, you're balancing people's emotions, and you feel for them because you've been there.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's very difficult.
And it goes back to where we started this conversation, where you were talking about the meltdowns that you had, and I think we all have them. we all, when we have, and actually this ties in with your point about rejection. You were talking about advice for writers or things that you see that help writers. You talked about bounce back ability, which I quite like. I certainly feel that if I have too many rejections in a week, I'm pretty resilient, but there are times when even I start to feel like hiding under the covers. But I think going back to what you said, just being able to pick yourself up and realizing that in time, that rejection, you'll see it differently is so helpful.
Yeah, definitely. It's hard. And I think don't beat yourself up as well. If you are finding it really hard, know that that is a totally normal thing. Like I used to think that I couldn't be a proper writer because I found it so difficult. And I've since learned that any writer seems to just, it doesn't matter. Like the 5th book I'm working on now is by far the hardest book, and I'm finding editing it awful. And I keep thinking, what have I done wrong? And I just think, actually, I think this is just the process. And I think you also forget how
Just the process.
Yeah. And I'm trying not to beat myself up. So I'll give that advice to everyone. If you're finding it hard, you're not doing anything wrong. It just is hard.
And you talked a little bit about juggling your work with your creative work. So you've designated a Monday, but is there anything else you do to sort of make sure that you stick to the Monday, or that you are in the right frame of mind so that you can truly separate the two?
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite big on setting timers, because especially when you have a whole day, you think, oh, I've got ages, and you find yourself kind of milling about. So I really like to get up early and go to a coffee shop to write, because then no one can distract me. I can't, not that I like housework, but I can't go out and take my dog a walk or do the washing up. I'm out and people are watching me. I feel like people are watching me in the cafe. They're not. So I have to just sit and write, which is a big help. Yeah, I can drink a lot of coffee. And I will give myself really strict targets. I write an entire plan. I'm quite like a planning person of like, I will sit and I'll work back. So I have to write an 80,000 word draft. I'll be like, right, when do I need to start writing that draft? How many words a day do I need to get to? And I will mark out all the days I know I'm 100% not going to be able to write. Like this past weekend, I had my edits due, but I was away for a family birthday in the Peak District. So I just designated those as no writing days, whereas I would have used to been like, oh, I'll try and fit it in somewhere. And being really realistic and being like, it's not going to happen at a family party. We are not going to suddenly have 3 hours spare where I can write. So being honest with yourself, I think you can kind of overly ambitious. And then once you actually work with the days you've got rather than the days you'd like to have, it gets a bit easier, I think.
And what if you have designated a day for writing and you sit down at the desk or whatever with your coffee in a cafe and you just think, I don't want to do this. I'm not feeling it.
I mean, that happens to me.
What do you do?
I do a 20-minute timer and I say, I'm just going to write for 20 minutes. As long as I finish, as long as I have written something in 20 minutes, whatever it is, I'm going to be happy and I'm going to be done. I've never then finished at 20 minutes. It's just that taking that pressure off me to say, I do it the same with, I'm a runner, but a bad one. I'm not a good runner, but I like running. And I always say, I'm just going to go out and I can come back after 10 minutes as long as I go out for 10 minutes. Because then by the time you've done it, by the time you've been running for 10 minutes, you're like, I'm not going to go back home now. And I think exactly the same with writing. It's breaking that pressure you have on yourself where you're like, I've got the whole day to write and I'm going to write 3,500 words. I just go, I'm going to write for 20 minutes. And then the timer usually goes off and I just stop it and carry on writing. And if that's all you can do that day, that is fine. There has been some days, particularly with this book, where I haven't met my goal. And to be honest, that's the first one that's happened to me. I'm quite big on just like pushing through. But there's been a few times I've just gone, do you know what? It's not the day. You are too tired. You have too much going on. You're going to just find another way to do it. But yeah, the 20-minute thing psychologically just always helps me.
Now in this community, we often talk about the negative voices that we deal with, whatever they are. They're different for everybody, but maybe it's something that says, nobody cares. I really shouldn't be doing this. Why am I bothering? I'm not successful enough. I'm too old, too whatever we want to make up. What's your relationship with those kind of voices, and how do you live with them or overcome them?
So one of the biggest things I did for my writing, which is very not like me, is I joined a creative coaching program run by the author Sophie Hannah called Dream Author, that is basically all about mindset for authors. And when I joined, it was like £600, which for me is a huge amount of money. But I was in like peak meltdown about my book coming out. It was when I knew I didn't really have any publicity. I thought it was going to flop, and I felt so bad about it. And I thought, I just don't want this to be my life, to where I just beat myself up. So she does a lot of like mindfulness work about kind of changing the story you're telling yourself. And when you have a thought like that, which I have all the time, I'll be like, why am I stressing myself out? Nobody cares. And then I think, well, actually, what evidence do I have? Like, you can keep telling yourself a story and you prove it to be true. What are the opposites to that? So how many times have I had messages from readers telling me they like my books, or how many times have I read something I like? And I think when you start looking for those positives and you actively try and reframe that, and that's the thing with like me, when I say like I think my writing career has been a huge success, that is because of the Sophie Hannah thing that I've done. Because I think, well, actually, if I solely looked at how much I earn from writing and how many of my book sales versus how much time I put into it, you wouldn't know, you'd have to be pretty wild to look at that and be like, yeah, that's a really, really financially good thing. Well done, you. But if you think, well, I've got a salary from Jericho Writers, I probably wouldn't be the MD of a writing company if I wasn't writing books. And then all these friends I've got, all these experiences I have, like doing this tonight, like that, my life's changed because of it. And that's because I've reframed the story from what do I think of my writing life? And instead of just going, what most people do, which is what sales do I get? Where am I in the Kindle charts? Have I ever been featured in the Sunday Times bestseller list, which I obviously haven't. And I do actually think I'm probably feel a lot better about my writing, despite being less commercially successful than a lot of people I know who are big commercial successes. So I think remembering you do have the ability to shape that story. You're all storytellers. You can tell yourselves whatever stories you like. So why not tell yourself a story where you're this huge success and you're going to look back on this and think, I'm so glad that I pushed through that, because look at what I've achieved. And even if you don't ever achieve that huge big goal, even if I never top the Sunday Times, but even if I stay at this stage forever, I think, well, is anything that I've done up to it a loss? Like, is making these writing friends, is giving myself a chance, is spending time writing something I love, is that ever a waste? And it's not.
That's beautiful. I really needed to hear this. Thank you.
Oh, good.
That's beautiful. So maybe just one or two more questions from me, and then we're going to open it up to you all. So if you have any questions, now is a great time to put it in the chat. We'll soon be inviting you to turn your video on. What are your ambitions now as a writer? So you're currently editing a book, your 5th book, that will be coming out next year.
Yes, April, I believe.
April of next year. What else what is your lots of different ways of phrasing this, but either what is your mountaintop? What are you aiming towards? Or what are you dreaming of or working towards?
I would quite like to change genre. I don't know if I will or not yet, but I feel like 5 books in, I am less inspired by the genre. It's always I think it will always be my favorite genre to read. But for me, at the moment, I don't have a big idea, and I've always had lots of ideas. And at the moment, there's nothing I really want to say that I can do through a psychological thriller. And it's not that I have another idea for anything else, because I actually don't. But I feel like maybe I'll change genre, and that will be my next thing, of having a bit of a break to really spend some time thinking about those ideas, and really writing something that I love and that I feel really passionate about and that I can't wait to tell people about. That's my goal for the next book. But after that, I don't really know. Like, I don't have this big great career plan. I think life is very unstable, kind of does what it wants. So I kind of just focus on what do I want immediately next, and that served me quite well so far. So I think I know that I do want this break to just kind of replenish my creative battery is probably how I'd put it, and just fall back in love with everything, I think.
Sounds like a lovely approach. I feel like you're very kind to yourself, actually, which I really appreciate.
That's really interesting. I think it's one of my really lovely friends, Janelle, who I met through writing, is she's also a writer. She's not published yet, but she will. And she has taught me so much about that stuff. And I honestly, whenever I'm feeling lazy or that I'm not, I always think, what would Janelle tell me to do? And it really, having that one friend in your head who will always tell you to rest and take things slower and that you're doing the right thing. Like, she's been a huge influence on me.
I love that. We interviewed a guy called Dr. Isaac Polentensky. We talked about mattering and happiness, and he said you have to diversify your sources of happiness, and one of those is making sure that you surround yourself with people that add value to your life, that aren't narcissists, that don't bring you down, that raise you up.
A big thing. Yeah, I do. Like the last few years has been kind of changing of friendship groups and changing of people in my life, but I do feel like everyone in my life now is just so positive, and my husband is so like that as well. Like he's so proud of me, and he's always telling me to do less and just rest a bit more. So I'm glad that that's how I'm perceived, because I do try. It's not natural. Naturally, I'm very hard on myself, but I have to work very hard not to, because I don't think it really helps anybody.
That's absolutely right. Well, thank you so much. It's been really lovely talking to you, but we have some wonderful writers in this room with us. So I invite you all to turn your videos on if you'd like to say hello to Sophie, and then we will take it in turns to ask your questions. So do say hello. These are all the lovely writers of our community who've been sitting alongside you. And if you've got your video on, I will invite you to ask your question directly, others I'll ask it on your behalf. So let me just check and see who's here. All right, I might ask Sophie. We'll start with Sophie's question. And this is from a little bit earlier in the interview. Sophie asks, do you think that an agent would have helped you get your paperback printing or your rights back? So this is about your first book.
Yeah, I mean, I did have the agent when we were going through that deal, and she was trying to convince Simon & Schuster to do a paperback, but they weren't particularly interested. So I think from them, like, there wasn't that real incentive to get it done. I think they knew it would be unlikely. But maybe a different agent would have had a different approach. I think a different agent maybe would have pushed hard on the contract, because the contract, they took all the rights for everything. So I sold all of those rights to them, but there wasn't a clause that they had to publish them, which obviously you don't. And like the conversations we'd had before had been very much, oh, we always do publish in all formats, so we will. And I later learned that wasn't the case with me. So that was a learning thing of good intentions don't make a contract, and get things in a contract.
Because I've definitely seen, so just to interject on this, I've been on the other end of contracts at a publishing house where we had to print on demand in order to keep the rights. So we were just publishing in small quantities, so that we would retain the rights. So it
is strange. I do have a reversion clause in there, and I have thought about just self-publishing it. But
your auntie, if no one else.
I know, just for her. But yeah, I think, again, like when we're talking about like what I might do next, I think that's the sort of thing I'll think about. Like if I had the time and headspace. I love that book. I'm really proud of that book, and I'd love to have it out in different formats. So we shall see. I always see it as like, and this is what, like, some of the stuff I've been following with what Bold would have done is that just because a book hasn't done well with one publisher, it doesn't mean that life of the book is over. And that seems more and more common now, of being bought up by other publishers. And that's kind of what I hope for with that book. I feel like it will get a second lease of life one day.
Yeah, well, I hope that for you. Let's see, next question. Kirsten's crossing her fingers for you. Neil asks, what would be your biggest piece of advice to staying motivated and disciplined as an author while working close to full time? Specifically asking as someone who has written a few drafts of books but hasn't moved to next steps yet.
I always think put dates on stuff. Like, I'm really good with a deadline. I say I'm really good, I don't always meet them, but I can't work without a deadline, and I've always set myself deadlines. And one thing I found particularly helpful was I was really into competitions. I really loved entering novel competitions, because it always gave that deadline was coming and it wasn't going to stop for you. So finding things, even whether it's with a friend or just getting that external thing where you think, right, it's got to be done, because I think there's a temptation with writers to hold on to something forever, because it will never be perfect. Like my books, even when I send them off and I do the proofread, I don't send them off going, yep, this is perfect, I 100% want this out in the world. I go, God, if I had another year, I would change this book completely. And I don't think you're ever going to feel like the book is ready. So I think having those external deadlines that you have to stick to, or even if you just make them yourself, and that you have to sit down with a conversation with yourself and say, okay, why haven't I done it? Is it that my deadline was unrealistic, which is what I often do? And in case, then how do I set my new deadline? And what happens when I stick to it? And give yourself a treat, like celebrate it. But yeah, it can be really hard. I need dates and I need times of when I'm doing stuff.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for the question, Neil. Kirsten, you had a question. Has that been answered now, or would you like to ask it? It was on having found her style from book one. Just comment in the chat if you've. No, go ahead.
Thank you. that was the thing. I'm also writing a psychological thriller where it's really the crime is a byline almost. And I don't know that, like you've now expressed yourself, that I have plenty of those in me. Because this is just my first book, and my deadline is a certain age of mine and all of this. So similar to yours. Should one stay with one genre, and if you change, is it a problem? A little bit more about the genre thing, because when you write your first book, you can't know that you've landed on your voice.
Yeah, I think it's hard, and we always say to writers, like, your publisher's going to want a couple at least books in the same genre. So if for like, when sometimes people come to us and they say, I'm writing a rom-com, I hate rom-coms, I just had this one idea, and we're like, no, because it depends what you want again from it. If you want to be commercially published, it doesn't make sense to publish in a genre that you don't want to stay in, at least for a couple of books. But people do swap genres all the time, and people often write in 2 genres under 2 different names, or 3 genres on a couple of different names. So it's not that you're wedded to it for the rest of your career, but I would write in a genre that you are going to be happy to write a good couple of books. Like, I think 5 for me is a good amount to swap over.
Can I just add to that? I don't know that I would stay with the genre per se, but I would stay with the theme. For me, it's I don't like when people are preached to the converted. So if there's a thing I feel that people could, some wisdom I've picked up in life, I'd like to share. I would always like to try and do that, but I don't want to do kumbaya. So I like to wrap it up in something a little bit more interesting. So the theme would be the same. Do you think I would get away with that?
I think it really depends on the sort of publisher you go with. Like, we were talking about, like Bookouture, they're very tight on genre. So they wouldn't want you to do like something with a romantic element and then something with a crime, because they're very keen on building readership. And for them, the money goes into your first book might not do amazingly, but you get your readership. Your second book will build them up. So they have a very specific strategy. But maybe a smaller indie publisher might be happy to put out one book that's loosely tied to another book. So I think, just think, if you aren't the sort of person who wants to be very tied down to sticking within a genre confine, that's where you want to be careful about your publishers. But like, even with my publisher, who are very collaborative, they're quite open. The book I originally wanted to be my 3rd book, my 4th book, so my 3rd with them, they didn't take. I wrote 10,000 words of it. I really liked it, and it was still thriller, but it was slightly more crimey. And they were like, this is too crimey. We're really trying to build you up as a psychological thriller author, whereas this is more of a thriller author. And they wouldn't take it. But that's when we had the 10 pitches of random other ideas, which I was surprised at, because I thought it was quite in genre, but apparently it wasn't. You never really know. I think I'd start, like, when it's first book, I would write the book you want to write. In all honesty, I did not know hardly any of this about the publishing industry when I started, and I'm kind of glad I didn't, because I just think, it can be a bit overwhelming as well. Would it have put me off if I'd had too many rules in my head? Probably. Like, I think you can make things up as you go. I always say to people, do not worry too much about it until you're at the stage where you're actually looking for them. Write the book you really love.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you for those questions, Kirsten. Let's see. I think, Sue, you had a question about ambition, which I think we might have answered. Let me know if you have a follow-up. Neil, you had a question about balancing Sophie's work, which I think we've answered, but let me know in the chat if you have a follow-up. Next up, Jane, you have a question around other genres, if you'd like to ask it.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just really curious, because you've been talking about genre and maybe about mixing things up. I just wonder what other genres would appeal to you to write in, because I was thinking about it. I did a BBC Maestro course with Ken Follett, and he does kind of, the type of thing, it's like thriller type of thing, and then he's gone into historical fiction. So I don't know if that appeals to you, but just interesting.
Yeah. Not historical. I'm deeply lazy, and I only like writing research. Historical, because I just can't take the time to get into the world. So I really love rom-coms. Like I will watch any sort of rom-com. I just finished watching Rivals on Disney by the Jilly Cooper adaptation, which I just loved so much, and it was so joyous and just silly, and I just thought, what an amazing career to write things that make people happy and that are about life and all sorts of issues, but are ultimately just really fun and real escapism. And I think that's maybe the way I want to go, where something where it's more joyful. But I must admit, I find it really hard to write things that don't have like a really dark side. I've often tried to write things which are lighter, and then someone ends up dying, and I don't quite know how I do it. Or the other thing I really love, which I don't think I would write, but I kind of feel I'm amazed that I don't, is more like YA, like teen stuff. Like if there is a film about a teen drama, things like Gilmore Girls, anything that is aimed at young girls that are far younger than me, I'm watching. And I just take so much joy from that kind of like teen romance. I love stories about teenagers, but I'm not sure whether I'd go into the YA world because it kind of scares me a little bit. There's a lot of kind of who you are as an author and who you are as a person that gets brought into the YA world that I just don't know if I would enjoy as an author. I kind of like being an adult and being able to say what I want. So yeah, I think maybe some sort of rom-com thing. I'm not sure.
Do you think that would be too much of a leap for your readership? I hope you don't mind if I
No,
add
it
that
really
question.
yeah, I think I would probably have to maybe do it under a new name, but I actually don't write under my married name because I started writing before I was married, and I actually don't use my married name anyway. But I really wanted to keep my name as I've grown up with it, as the person that I wrote it under. So I do have another name that would still be my name that I could publish under, which I don't know, this is where I should have an agent. This is the bit where I really need an agent, because it's kind of all that career planning that at the moment I'm just making up in my head. So we shall see. It might be that I don't do it.
Are you actively looking for an agent?
Not at the moment. I kind of had a chat with a couple of agents earlier in the year, but because I really want this break, I want to go to an agent when I'm really ready to work and I'm all in, and I feel like mentally it's not the right place for me to be doing that big career leap, and I kind of want to enjoy it. Like I don't want the pressure of an agent saying, okay, we're going to do a career leap, that means you need to have a draft in an X amount of time, because I feel like I've been on that treadmill for 4 years. And what I really want is that thing that, like, having my Mondays as my writing day, where I sit in a cafe and I just twiddle and I think, what do I want to write, instead of like opening my laptop and being like, right, 3,500 words, bam. I feel like I don't have enough thinking space, and I don't think an agent would help me with that at the moment. So I definitely do want an agent again. I haven't minded being without an agent. That was a choice, and I haven't tried to get an agent since, but I do want one, just to be like, is it a silly idea to try and do a romance novel, for example?
All right, I think we have one final question. So Jen is in the room. She actually hosts our mystery, crime and thriller room, and she has a question for you. And if anyone is interested in writing any of these, mystery, crime or thriller, do join Jen's room.
I've just put the link in the chat.
Thank
Thank you so much, Sophie. I just absolutely loved this talk. It's great. I'm wondering about popularity and how difficult it is to get a publisher interested when you're looking at a subgenre within something like mystery, crime, or thriller. So if you're looking at speculative fiction within a psychological thriller, or within the crime or mystery or fantasy or something like that, where it's not generally what you would see in the marketplace, but what you're writing. So how hard is that to get someone interested in your subgenres?
I think it depends on what it is. I think anything that is more niche is going to be more difficult because there's less people interested, but I think nothing's impossible. There will be publishers out there looking for that kind of thing. It also might be a clever way of dressing it up. If you think of something like is it between her eyes, behind her eyes, the Sarah Pinborough?
Yeah.
I mean, that's unusual. That was marketed as a thriller, a psychological thriller, but that was weird. That was kind of spooky a bit. And I think they marketed that cleverly, because I would never have read that because it's not really my thing. I loved it. But if they brought out that element of the kind of I can't even think of exactly what happens, but it's a bit like Alien-y, isn't it? It's like time trip sort of stuff. So I think there can be ways that if you're facing a lot of rejection, you think it might be that element, maybe thinking about how strong that element is in the book. And whether that is the bit you really love. I mean, I do have a friend who is with a publisher, and she's just been told to take out the kind of slightly more woo element that isn't even that strange, but it's not straight thriller, and she's quite a straight thriller author. So publishers can be a little bit hesitant to take a risk on stuff like that, but there will be people. It's like anything, isn't it? The more mass appeal they've got, the easier it is for them to market. And it might be that it's maybe a more risky thing for your first book, but it would later in your career not be a risky thing 2-3 books in. But yeah, I don't know, it very much does depend on the publisher, and they change what they want all the time. So you never really know. I think it's really hard to write for market. I mean, when my second book went out on submission, Keep Them Close, it went out to quite a lot of the big editors, and they all said similar thing, which is, oh, I really like this. We're not taking anything on with a social media element at the moment, because the last few we've had haven't sold well. I couldn't have known that. I couldn't have known that would be a thing, because when I wrote the book, there was lots of books out like that, and everyone thought they would do well, and they didn't do well, so therefore they wouldn't take mine. So, you know, in hindsight, I could have gone, oh, I shouldn't have written a social media book, but I'm not psychic. No one's psychic, and the editors 6 months ago wouldn't have known that those books they were plugging weren't going to sell. So I think you have to write what you want and then just take it from there, because you can always write another book or downplay or play up the different elements.
Very true. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jen, for the question. Thank you, Sophie. And that brings us to the end of this interview. It's been wonderful, Sophie, to sit and chat with you. I love your honesty and your wisdom. I'll think a lot about this bounce back ability, this resilience that we must have. It's been such a pleasure to write with you. How can we continue to support you? Where can we follow you on social media or on different platforms? Is it your Substack?
You can follow my Substack, but then I'll just feel more guilty about the fact I never write anything on it. But I do Twitter quite a lot, and Instagram are the best places. I have a Facebook, which I never update. So yeah, Twitter and Instagram are the best places to find me.
Wonderful. And your latest book is out now, and that's digital. Is that in paperback and digital?
Yes, I have.
What Stays Unsaid?
It's in ebook as well, actually, with a slightly different color. Sorry, audiobook, which is quite fun because they have 5 different narrators, which is quite fun to listen to. And they also try and do slightly Bristolian accents, despite all being from London, so you can enjoy that.
Well, that's so awesome. We'll be sharing links with the recording, plus on our podcast. Sophie, it's been such a pleasure. Friends, I invite you to unmute yourself, and let's give Sophie a London Writers' Salon round of applause. Thank you so much, Sophie.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you both.
I think, Sophie, you do have a little bit of magic. Spending some time with you certainly makes me feel so much more optimistic about my writing and about the world. So thank you. Really enjoyed this. Have a lovely, lovely rest of your day, everyone. Sophie, thanks again.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone. And just a reminder, we have Writers Hour at 9 o'clock. So in 25 minutes, if you want to write with us in silence, head to writershour.com. I'll see you soon. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, friends.